look at the government budget constraint, or really what we mean by government when we talk about a macroeconomic model. But let's just take a quick review here of the model that we've got, the graph that we're using. Remember that point A is, we refer to this as the inflationary gap. This is the idea the economy would be above potential. Point C is the recessionary gap, where the economy is below potential. And then B is the point where the economy is, as shown here, the long-run equilibrium. The idea here is that the aggregate demand curve could shift through one of these points. I happen to show it here, going through the long-run equilibrium point. Keep in mind, too, that AD represents aggregate demand, and we're going to look at it in terms of four components: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. These are the same components that appeared in our calculation of real GDP when we did it by expenditure. Now, keep in mind, too, that real GDP, in fact, is observed after the fact. So that means that we're looking at what happened last year. Aggregate demand is forward thinking, so it's like planned consumption, planned investment, planned government purchases, and so on. Very good introduction to this whole concept of aggregate demand is to look at the government budget constraint, and so that's what we're going to do now. So, but before we do that, remember that the aggregate demand curve can shift to the left or the right, which would mean that there has to be a change in one of these variables, C, I, G, or net exports, and there are two different macroeconomic stabilization policies. One is called fiscal policy, the other one is called monetary policy. And there's also another thing that can shift the aggregate demand curve left or right, is referred to as a shock, something that's not a policy. Policies are generally to be considered, they're applied, whereas a shock is something that's unexpected, random, something outside, for example, a foreign external force of some sort. Now, I want to look at specifically this variable G, how the government goes about deciding or planning what its purchases are. So we're going to look at this variable G here. And in simple terms, the government purchases, how can it pay for them? It has three ways. The first is taxes, and I'm going to use the letter T to represent taxes. The second is it can borrow, and it does this by printing bonds. We'll talk later about what this means, a bond. Print new bonds and sell them. The third possibility is to print new money. The government can pay for its purchases through just simply printing new money. This may seem kind of strange, but it doesn't. Incidentally, there is no other, this is why it's called a government budget constraint. There are no other methods for the government to pay for its purchases except for one of these three mechanisms. A little point here to the side is that because we talk about real and nominal, T, taxes, are considered in a macroeconomic model a real variable, whereas M and B are nominal variables. So in actual fact, I should be dividing these values here by P, which would be the price of the real GDP. I'm going to simplify things and not worry about that. A little point about government and macroeconomics to clarify things. And this is actually useful to understand the role of government within a society as well. In a macroeconomic model, the government doesn't produce anything. The government simply buys. It's the economy, meaning to say society, people, the various resources, natural resources or labor, physical capital, physical resources we have, buildings, roads, and so on. These are the things that produce, that lead to aggregate supply. So the government, its role that it plays in a macroeconomic is simply to buy, and it's the letter G. Of course, it has to pay for these purchases through things like taxes, and it has macroeconomic policy. But the important point, government doesn't produce anything. Another point is that when I speak of government in this model, I'm going to be speaking exclusively, or rather, this raises the point here that the government is not the same thing as the country. So when we speak about which is a very important point to think about, is that the U.S. government is not the same thing as the United States, or what people call America. Just like the Canadian government is not the same thing as Canada. This entity, Canada, the rocks and trees and the people that live here, will exist for thousands of years into the future. The Canadian government, of course, it may change. We've had a federal government, federal system of government for 150 years. It may change in the future. There's nothing that... So the distinction here, though, is when we speak of government, it's not the same as the country where people are living. And this is very clear in macroeconomics. Another point in this specific macroeconomic model is that I'm only referring to the federal government in Canada. I'm not referring to the provincial government, Quebec government, or city government, municipal government. And the reason for this is only the federal government in Canada can print money to pay for its purchases. That means to say if the Quebec government wants to buy something, it can borrow, it can tax, but it doesn't have the ability to be able to print money and pay for its purchases that way. This becomes very important in macroeconomics. So make it clear that whenever I speak about when I speak of the government and macroeconomic model, I'm referring to, in the case of Canada, the federal government, or in the United States, the government in Washington. Something else about these government purchases, a big part of the government budget in Canada is transfers between people, roughly half of the budget. That means to say the government simply takes from person A and gives it to person B. These are referred to as transfers, and I'm not going to consider them in a macroeconomic model. Means the government goes out and purchases, for example, my services to teach, or it hires an engineer to build the bridge to cross or a company to build a bridge to across the St. Lawrence River. So it's the actual purchase of a good or service. Something else, of course, is very important in an economy is that the government enacts a whole series of laws and regulations that have an effect on how people go about their business and what they're doing. In a macroeconomic model, this is all ignored. Well, I shouldn't say in this very simplified model, it's ignored. I'm also I'll maybe look at this later, but I'm going to ignore, as part of the budget, the interest on past debt. That means the government has borrowed in the past, has to pay interest on it. I'm going to ignore that here as well.